The most notable part of the Philadelphia Brewing Company was that it was on the land of the old El Aliso winery, but then things started to take off in 1882 when it was bought by two men. The first was a Bavarian immigrant from Wollemzach named Joseph Meyer, who moved to LA with his younger brother in the early 1870s and got a job at the New York Brewery before he quit and bought the Eintracht Saloon at 163 North Spring Street in 1881 on the precipice of the big year, 1882. His early life story isn't quite so eventful, but his later life sure is sad. The second man had a much more interesting early life, and his name was George Zobelin. He was born in 1846 in Grafenberg, Bavaria. He was the son of a brewer, a Milwaukee brewer. When he was 17, he apprenticed as a brewer himself, but when the 7 Weeks War broke out in 1866, he was taken prisoner for several weeks. They didn't say exactly how many weeks, but it's safe to assume not more than 7.
Between 6 to 8.
In 1867, he came to California, opening up grocery stores in mining boom towns. But once the silver boom was over in 1869, he came to LA and opened up a grocery store at 6th and Spring. But he soon wanted to get back into brewing and ended up getting a job bookkeeping at the mythical New York Brewery in 1870, which is where he met Joseph Meyer. The two got it in their heads that, hey, we can do this. We like beer. We know what we're doing. You can do the books. You can do the thing. I'll cash in.
You got a big mustache and I talk a lot.
You have a hat, I have a hat. So then came the big year, 1882, when Meyer and Zobelin bought the Philadelphia Brewing Company and renamed it Meyer and Zobelin. It wasn't so crazy that these two no-name German immigrants bought an entire brewing factory because they were part of the same wave of German immigrants buying up brewing factories like Adolphus Busch and Frederick Miller.
Okay, yeah.
Same class. They grew the factory into a very profitable enterprise, and the compound itself grew as well, which is why once the 101 was eventually built, it had to be curved in that area like it still is today. That's the footprint of this brewery. But even as it grew and changed, they always protected the sycamore, Aliso tree, that had been there since the time of Yang Na. At this point, it was over 400 years old, but in 1892, one of its branches fell and crushed an entire beer wagon.
Wow.
So Meyer, with Zobelin begging him not to, had all of the branches cut off the tree, leaving just the trunk, which killed it. A 400-year-old sacred tree.
And it was killed because it destroyed a beer wagon.
Because a beer man...
What? Are you serious?
Then, in 1895, the dead trunk was cut down by a local lumberjack named William Willoughby. The tree was so famous that people were taking its wood chips as souvenirs. This tree was said to have been located 153 feet north of Commercial Street and 88 feet east of Gary, which is apparently under a 101 on-ramp right now. So there's probably... someone's defecating on that as we speak.
Oh my God, that bums me out so much.
But remember that this tree, which will bum you out even more, had been very special to the native tribes, which maybe is why from then on Meyer's life was obviously cursed. Get this. On December 16th, 1886, after the tree was dead, a vat exploded in the factory and left Meyer horrendously burned on his face and hands.
God, like Two-Face.
In 1897, his teenage daughter died. Then Meyer himself was struck with a serious heart disease and had to be confined to his house at 1606 South Figueroa for 2 years before he finally died on July 11th, 1905. There's more coming, but we'll get into that as we go. Meyer owned a majority of the brewing company, so he left control of it to his son Freddie, which Zobelin did not like. So on August 1st, 1905, he sued for control of the company and eventually got it in March 1906. However, you wouldn't think a year-long lawsuit for control of a company would create an undesirable work environment, but it did. So in 1907, the Meyer sons bought Zobelin out of the company for $500,000, and he struck out on his own, which I'll get into soon. But first, the shocking conclusion, and I do mean conclusion, of the Meyer family. Once Zobelin left, the company was renamed Meyer Brewery, but in 1910, Freddie Meyer died, his son, who was in control, and then control of the company went to his brother, Eddie. Here's yet another crossover. Eddie Meyer was a big baseball fan, and in 1910, he gained control of a team in the Southern California Trolley League called the Myers. He also came into control of the Vernon Tigers of the Pacific Coast League and made Meyer beer a big part of advertising in those games. He's the one who brought the Tigers to Venice. He wanted them to play in a stadium on a pier that went out into the ocean, but a storm destroyed the pier during construction, and they never rebuilt it. Find out more about that team in our episode Uproot Root Root for the home team. team, or listen again and experience the magic one more time. Eddie kept the company going strong, but then the Prohibition hit, and he managed to keep it going like many breweries did by making soft drinks and near beer, which I don't know if you'll get into that.
A little bit, not much.
It's beer that was under the 0.5% alcohol content. That was the limit of the Volstead Act. All the same, on March 30th, 1932, 10 federal agents raided the Meyer Brewery and found that they had been brewing not so near beer illegally.
Real beer.
Close beer. Eddie swore so close it's beer.
I can't believe it's not beer.
Oh, it is. Eddie swore he wasn't aware of this, but 2 employees were arrested, and he lost control of the company for 7 years as the federal government took it over.
Oh, boy. And they ran that baseball team all the way to the World Series.
You guys are going to do it or you're all going to prison. Still, this wasn't the worst thing to happen to Eddie around this time, as the Meyer family curse continued and his wife died in a car crash in 1933. Then in 1943, the curse finally cleaned house once and for all when Eddie himself died alone in a fire in his house. Shouldn't have cut down that tree, buddy boy.
No, leave trees alone. Old ancient trees, don't touch them.
No, you don't need more wood. Let it crush a truck. It wants its due.
It needs its sacrifice.
But Meyer Brewing went on, but after World War II, their brand needed a little pepping up, so they changed their recipe a little and renamed their lager Brew 102. Here's how the jingle went. More than 100 beers we did brew, perfecting the new finer Brew 102. In the East and the West, Meyer beer is the best. Wonderful, wonderful Brew 102.
Did we write that? That's how bad it is.
Apparently, lazy rhymes was all it took back then, because the new Brew 102 became very popular, and by the end of the 40s, because it had a number in it, no one had seen that before.
Number in the song.
By the end of the 40s, Meyer Brewing was the 5th largest brewer in the state, and by the 50s, they were making 370,000 barrels of beer a day, which they hung on the wall and sang about all day as they slowly took them down one at a time. But back to the split in 1907. Zabelin was out of beer, and he needed a drop quick. Luckily, there was one place that was on the market, the Los Angeles Brewing Company, finally. A place with the guts to name it. Yeah. They had opened in 1897 at 1920 North Main Street, right where the San Antonio Winery would eventually be, by P. Max Kuhnrich and Edward Matthey. They were right next to the LA River and were using that water to make a lager, Mission Malt Tonic, and a near beer called Temperance. And since all of that sounded gross, Zabelin bought the brewery right after he split from the Meyers in 1907, and he turned it into a really great place, not followed by an awful curse from a dead tree. They had 20 acres of land between the river and the railroad tracks, and they started making things like Old Mission Tap, Old Tap Lager, a potent Bock, and the most popular beer called simply... Oh, I've been talking about beards this whole time. Beard factories.
Oh, no, wait, let's re-record.
Oh, my.
Nice wet beards.
Delicious, frothy, heady beards. So this popular beer was called simply Eastside.
I like that.
Yeah, Eastside, because the brewery was on the east side, and the entire place was also sometimes went by the name Eastside Beverage Company.
That's so simple it could be hipster.
I wouldn't be surprised. Okay. Well, it kind of, you'll see. Zabelin set up a tap room inside the brewery called the Old Mission Room. Everyone's still obsessed with that mission. That became a very popular tourist destination, and even cooler was that the entire brewery was unionized.
Oh, great.
In a time when the city was shockingly anti-union, all workers in Zabelin's brewery were well paid. They got vacation time, had safe working conditions, paid lunches, and you're going to love this. Every hour, each worker got a 7-minute beer break where they could go drink free unlimited beer.
You're right, I love that.
Every hour, work for 53 minutes, and then go get quickly drunk.
I like my employees to be buzzed at all times throughout the day.
Never let them fade out.
You keep that fire lit, boys.
And if they wanted to take any beer home, they got 50% off.
Wow.
But then the Prohibition hit and put an end to the fun. To survive these dark and dry times, they rebranded themselves the Zesto Beverage Company and made apple cider, pineapple juice, and a near beer version of Eastside. Turns out they weren't too good at making apple cider because their batches kept fermenting too much and turning alcoholic, so they had to stop selling it.
We swear we want apple juice.
We didn't know.
We didn't know.
Also, nobody wanted pineapple juice, so then they started making root beer, but what was selling really well was the alcohol that they would extract from the Eastside beer.
I bet.
The way they were making this Eastside near beer was that they'd make the beer like normal and then extract the alcohol from it, and there was a huge market for this denatured alcohol, and companies that made things like paint and vanilla extract, and also doctors and dentists.
Oh, like alcohol.
Yeah, it's not drinkable like pain reliever. Drinkable. Doctors under Prohibition were allowed to buy 5 gallons of alcohol a year, and dentists could have 2. They were also able to sell this true grain, as they called it, to hospitals and drugstores. But since they were still brewing Eastside beer normally all those years, once Prohibition ended, they were all ready to go selling alcohol again, like immediately without missing a beat. All they had to do was just don't remove the alcohol.
Yeah.
We know how to do this. So at 12:01 a.m. on April 7th, 1933, when Prohibition ended, hundreds of people were lined up on Main Street to watch Walter Huston say a few words, and then Gene Harlow smashed a bottle of Eastside on the side of the first post-Prohibition delivery truck from the once again named Los Angeles Brewing Company with their new catchphrase, "Put Eastside inside."
I like that.
Yeah. They had a whole fleet of trucks packed with beer and protected by armed guards that delivered to anybody who needed it in the city. And in that one night, the first night after Prohibition, they made $250,000 providing beer to the city that hadn't had it legally in over a decade.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Zobelin died in 1936, but his son took over and kept the beer flowing. In 1937, they started selling beer in cans and expanded their brews to include Eastside Ale, a brown derby beer, and luxury extra dry Pilsner, but classic Eastside was always their best seller.
Yeah.
It was considered the working man's beer, especially because of the way the company treated its employees. But then World War II hit, and all of the tires of the delivery trucks were needed to turn into bullets. But no matter, they just bought a bunch of Belgian horses pulling the beer wagons. Yeah. That's not a problem until the horses needed to be turned into bullets. Yeah, they got like the Clydesdales, the Budweiser Clydesdales. Copyright infringement. They would even hire young men who were of the age to be drafted in the military when most other companies wouldn't, because they knew that they'd only be there temporarily. They would still hire these people. Cool. It was a good company. They even had a housing complex next door to the factory for any workers who wanted to live there. The working man's beer. They cared about people.
I like Eastside.
Eastside.
Keep inside.
Yeah,
Eastside.
I say Eastside. Keep inside Eastside. The brewery faced even more trouble around this time when a paint company moved in across the street from them. You wouldn't think, well, it's a big deal, but just a paint company. Beer absorbs odors and flavors, so all the fumes coming from the paint factory made all their beer taste like paint.
I would have loved that.
Fortunately, the city was on the brewery's side because the workers there were mostly voters who would always vote in favor of their employee who treated them so well. So the city wanted to get on their good side. So the city got the paint company moved out of the area. They did not like that. But then in 1948, a company from Milwaukee decided that they wanted to expand their operations onto the West Coast and made the LA Brewing Company an offer it couldn't refuse. And they now became owned by Pabst.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but for the time, it was still being run by the Zobelin family, not the Milwaukee Fat Cats. They had nothing to do until 1953, when Pabst expanded the factory and ended up demolishing the worker housing and also all of the building's charm, and took full control of the factory and started using it to brew Pabst Blue Ribbon.
Boo.
Blue Ribbon.
That Blue Ribbon.
Eastside was...
I don't support PBR anymore. It's over.
No, they don't like unions.
They don't like unions.
I'm going on record saying that. Eastside was still being made there, although as an afterthought to Blue Ribbon. Eastside became the official beer of Dodger Stadium in 1962.
Really?
Yeah, but eventually it became less and less of a priority and was turned into a discount beer named Eastside Old Tap. This decline in local beer power started when major national companies like Anheuser-Busch and Schlitz opened up giant factories in Van Nuys in 1954, driving the local guys out of business. Budweiser factory's still there. I drove past it on the way here, got a good sniff, but the Schlitz one shut down in 1990. The Meyer Brewery had been sold in 1958 and kept making their Brew 102 until 1972, when they closed down for good and then got demolished in 1985. But a bunch of artifacts from the old Meyer and Zobelin days were uncovered when they were doing renovations on Union Station in the late 80s. They found a bunch of old cans and imprint of a tree trunk. The Eastside Brewery didn't fare much better when Pabst abandoned them in 1979 and they shut down. The building, that brewery building itself, was registered as a historic cultural Los Angeles city landmark in 1992, and in the early 2000s opened up again as the Brewery Artists Colony, which at the time it opened was the biggest live and work artists colony in the world.
I know that place too.